This is Susan C. Anthony speaking, and this workshop on philosophy is my foundational workshop for Christian homeschoolers. Philosophy is a big word with a simple meaning. Don't be intimidated. Most people are completely confused by philosophy, and my intent is to clear up the confusion for you. First, a little about me, so you get a sense of who's talking. I was born in Colorado and grew up in a rural area of the Rocky Mountains. I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Elementary Education and moved to Alaska in 1979. After 10 years with the Anchorage School District, I resigned so I could spend more time with my retired husband and tend to my little book business. I later served on the board of a homeschool charter school and traveled around the country presenting workshops like this to homeschool support groups and conventions. Now, we mainly travel for fun. The photo above was taken in Antigua, Guatemala in 2012. I took my mom, who still lives in Colorado, on a cruise through the Panama Canal. It was some of the best money I ever spent. We had a wonderful time together, and it was a perfect way to thank her for all she's done for me. After this hour-long workshop, I hope you will be in touch with a vision for your homeschool that will keep you inspired through good days and bad. I hope you will have begun to contemplate the big picture, the context for what you're doing, and be well on your way toward establishing a firm foundation for everything you do in your homeschool. There's a handout that can be downloaded from my website, susancanthony.com. There's a lot in the handout that I won't take time to talk about in detail during this session, so I would encourage you to print it out and at least scan through it. On the first page is a list of the 5 basic philosophical questions, the 5 basic philosophies of education, and the 5 questions that need to be answered in a philosophy of education. The second page contrasts answers to the 5 basic philosophical questions from a humanistic and a Christian perspective. The third page contrasts answers to the 5 philosophical questions in education from the perspective of progressivism and essentialism, 2 of the most popular educational philosophies. Don't worry, you'll learn what I mean by that today. The fourth page has a sample mission statement and a sample vision statement. Feel free to copy any parts of these you like as you write your own statements. On the bottom of page 4 are some lists of homeschool curriculums that line up with the most common educational philosophies. The last page has a sample philosophy statement for a homeschool. This can help you get started as you work to clarify and verbalize your own philosophy. So why a workshop on philosophy? The fact is that you have a philosophy of education whether you realize it or not. Most Americans aren't consciously aware of their philosophies. They're unconscious, unclear, and unexamined. Yet they're foundational and affect every choice we make. The foundation of a house is below ground, often invisible, and yet critical to the integrity of the structure. Any flaws in the foundation are likely to cause problems later that will be hard to fix without digging up the whole foundation and starting over. By contrast, if a foundation is straight and true, the building almost falls into place and is much easier to construct. My brother is a builder. He fusses when a foundation is even slightly imperfect. He knows how much trouble that can cause later on in the building process. You wouldn't build a triangular building on a rectangular foundation. The foundation directs what is to be built upon it. In the same way, once you're clear about your philosophy, it becomes a lot easier to choose materials and set priorities concerning how you use your time, energy, and money. I love Calvin and Hobbes. It's clear why Calvin's mom chose not to homeschool. Ask the teacher. If there are no questions, we'll move on to the next chapter. I have a question. Certainly, Calvin. What is it? What's the point of human existence? I meant any questions about the subject at hand. Oh. Frankly, I'd like to have the issue resolved before I expend any more energy on this. Most kids Calvin's age don't contemplate the meaning of human existence, at least not consciously, but all the why questions with which kids pester you trace back to those fundamental questions. One of the biggest questions you have to answer for kids is, why should I do this if I don't want to? The answer, because I said so, works to a point, but you should know why you're saying so, even if you don't explain the details to your child. One mom wrote this to me, and it's the reason I prepared this workshop. I have homeschooled for 5 years and have been doing it aimlessly, hoping I have covered some core areas good enough. I know I need more direction. Seneca, a Roman statesman who was alive at the time of Christ, wrote, "Our plans miscarry because we have no aim. When a man does not know what harbor he is making for, no wind is the right wind." Socrates wrote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Americans are generally a lot more comfortable with doing than with examining why they do what they do. Ours is a very action-oriented culture, but the age-old questions still trouble us, even if they're clouded in a whirl of activity. Alexis de Tocqueville was a Frenchman who came to America in the 1830s. He believed that democracy was the wave of the future for France and for the world, and he wanted to try and figure out how America had made it work. He wrote, "I think that in no country in the civilized world is less attention paid to philosophy than in the United States. Yet it is easy to perceive that almost all the inhabitants of the United States conduct their understanding in the same manner and govern it by the same rules. That is to say, without ever having to taken the trouble to define the rules, they have a philosophical method common to the whole people." This unconscious agreement that he refers to, the philosophical method common to the whole people, is, I think, what might be termed the Christian consensus. Because Christians and others pretty much took it for granted and didn't pay it much attention, it degraded over time. With some exceptions, it no longer exists. There are echoes of it. For example, Americans admire people who help the poor, even if they don't do so themselves. Americans in general believe that helping the poor is a good thing. That's not the case in every culture. In some cultures, helping the poor is viewed as stupid or even evil. If someone deserves to be poor, because they sinned in a previous life, it's not a laudable thing to interfere. I told you earlier that philosophy is a big word with a simple meaning. Here's the meaning. Philo means love, and soph means wisdom. So philosophy means love of wisdom. It's traditionally defined as the love of wisdom and the pursuit of truth. The word Philadelphia comes from the Greek word philo and means city of brotherly love. The word philosophy is mentioned only once in the Bible, in Colossians 2:8, where it says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ." The words wisdom and truth, however, are mentioned frequently in the Bible. Jesus is called wisdom in 1 Corinthians 1:30. By his doing, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God. Christ himself claimed to be truth in John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Christianity is called a religion rather than a philosophy because religion, it is said, assumes the existence of God, whereas philosophy makes no assumptions. Because some Christians in the past rejected reason, the charge has been leveled ever since that all Christians believe blindly and don't really care whether what they believe is true or not. That's not the case for every Christian, but a lot of people assume it's true. There are 5 and only 5 basic philosophical questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? And how then shall I live? All comprehensive philosophies or worldviews must answer all 5 questions. A good philosophy must be consistent, comprehensive, based on adequate evidence, and free from contradictions and absurdities. Christians and everyone else really should think clearly, correctly, and comprehensively as they evaluate truth claims and competing ideas. Anyone can make a truth claim. How can we know what is really true? Let's look at the first basic question. Are human beings naturally good or naturally flawed? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher, shocked the traditional establishment in the 1700s by asserting that people are naturally good. He wrote, "Let us lay it down as an incontrovertible rule that the first impulses of nature are always right. There is no original sin in the human heart." You might have heard it said that there are just 2 religions, works and grace. If man is good by nature, he can by his own efforts be good enough. If man is sinful by nature, he has no hope without grace. According to the Bible, people inherit a sin nature and are sinful because of who they are, not just because of what they do. King David wrote in Psalm 51, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." The nature of man is a foundational issue. Almost everything else will flow from your answer to that question. According to Rousseau and many philosophers, people are born perfect with no sin nature. They sin because their environment has damaged them. Frankenstein's monster in the novel by Mary Shelley was rejected by society because of his scary looks. He became evil as a result of that rejection. He said, "Everywhere I see bliss from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. If we make people happy, will they automatically become virtuous? Most people these days think so. In the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll attempted to separate from himself all that was bad. He wanted to become purely good. The result was that he ended up with two personalities, one spotlessly good and one purely evil. Dr. Jekyll said, "All human beings as we meet them are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil." The Bible says human beings are sinful by nature, that we cannot, by our own efforts, achieve perfection. It says we are sinful in our thoughts even more than in our deeds, that our sinful deeds flow from our sinful thoughts. People, according to this view, are naturally selfish, greedy, judgmental, and lustful to varying measures. Horace Mann, called the father of American public education, had boundless faith in the perfectibility of human beings. He thought public schools would serve as weapons against evil, as the great equalizer. He believed that 75 years after universal public schooling began, there would be no poverty, crime, or sickness. Well, here we are, more than 150 years later, and still plagued by poverty, crime, and sickness. The second question is, where did I come from? As with the first question, there are two possible answers. We are either here by accident or we're here on purpose. Carl Sagan says we're here by accident. We're a way for the cosmos to know itself. He wrote, "The cosmos is also within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." Sagan would say man created God rather than the other way around. If man created God, man can, of course, uncreate God at will. God's just imaginary anyway. Atheists say freedom begins with the death of God. Man is the measure of all things. Man is his own authority. Man can create utopia on earth. Every day in every way, things are getting better and better. Things are evolving in an upward direction. Scientists, not theologians, hold the key to truth. If God is really real, it means that we're here on purpose. Freedom begins with the fear of God, according to the Bible, not with the death of God. Morality is objective, not subjective. We will answer for our every thought and deed. God is an authority over us, whether we like it or not. Our hope is in God, not in our own abilities. In the Christian view, life has objective meaning and purpose. These two worldviews are utterly opposite. A result is that Christians often try to stamp out the fruits of humanism and secularism, such as abortion and homosexuality, without addressing the roots, while secularists and atheists aim straight for the foundation. This illustration was in a book by Ken Ham, and I thought it said a lot. Some of you might remember Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who befriended boys and then killed them. In his last interview with Stone Phillips on ABC's 2020, his dad sat next to him. His dad had sent him books about creation, which he read in prison while serving 15 life sentences. Dahmer accepted Jesus as his Savior, and in the interview reflected back on the foundational ideas that made his crimes seem justifiable at the time he committed them. He said, If a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believed the theory of evolution as truth, that we all just came from the slime. Dahmer was murdered by a fellow inmate the day before this interview aired on TV. The third basic philosophical question is, why am I here? What is my purpose? Without purpose, people default to either pride, looking good, or pleasure, feeling good. Having a clear sense of purpose makes a huge difference in a student's motivation to study and learn. Remember what Calvin said after asking, what's the point of human existence? He said, looking at his textbook, frankly, I'd like to have the issue resolved before I expend any more energy on this. John Dewey, who began the progressive education movement that we'll talk about in a bit, believed man's purpose was self-fulfillment. He wrote, "Nothing but the best, the richest, and fullest experience possible is good enough for man." Here are the fourth and fifth questions. Where am I going, and how then shall I live? The answers to these two questions flow from answers to the first three questions. If God exists and the Bible is true, our destiny is heaven or hell, depending on our choice. If there is no God, we're going to die, and that will be the end of it. The answer to the question, how then shall I live, depends entirely on whether there is a God with authority to set standards, or whether man is the measure of all things and has the authority to set his own standards. If God exists, truth is absolute, whether or not we like it or agree with it. If God does not exist, there is a possibility that there is no objective truth, that truth is relative, and we can individually choose what we want to believe is true. So again, the 5 basic questions of philosophy were, who am I, where did I come from, why am I here, where am I going, and how then shall I live? Now we'll move on to educational philosophy. There are 5, and just 5, basic schools of educational philosophy: perennialism, essentialism, progressivism, reconstructionism, and existentialism. The 2 above the line are more traditional and conservative, and those below the line are more modern and progressive. I'll talk about each of these in turn, and as I do, don't be worried about words. Think about what best reflects your personal philosophy, and you can learn some big words along the way here. Perennialism began with Plato in about 400 BC. Plato was an idealist who believed that the physical world we perceive is only a shadow of reality. Perennial means lasting for a long or apparently infinite time, enduring, continually recurring. You might have perennial plants in your garden. Plato wrote, "Men should concern themselves primarily with the search for truth. Since truth is both perfect and eternal, it cannot therefore be found in the world of matter that is both imperfect and constantly changing." According to the educational philosophy of perennialism, the world we perceive is only a shadow of reality. Truth is universal, constant, and unchanging. Knowledge exists in our minds already and needs only be brought to consciousness, or reduced, brought out. There's no need to memorize facts because facts change. Perennialism provides for general liberal education, and it does not really focus on vocational education. The Great Books studies are an example of perennialist curriculum. So Plato believed that truth is inborn, that we are born with all the knowledge we need, but that the teacher's role is to reduce it or draw it out and bring it to our consciousness. The essentialist school of educational philosophy began with Aristotle, Plato's student. Aristotle is often called the father of science. His philosophy is rooted in realism. He thought the world we perceive is real, not just a shadow of reality, as Plato believed. E.D. Hirsch, author of Cultural Literacy, expressed Aristotle's philosophy well when he wrote this: "In anthropological perspective, the basic goal of education in a human community is acculturation, the transition to children of the specific information shared by the adults of the group." Essentialists believe that the world we perceive is real and can be known through observation and experimentation. They believe there's a core of essential knowledge, which every educated adult should know, and that the purpose of education is to transmit culture. E.D. Hirsch actually made a comprehensive list of the core knowledge that every educated American should know. This is a detail from the painting School of Athens by Raphael. Notice that Plato on the left is pointing up toward the ideal. Aristotle is pointing to the real world in which we live. This painting illustrates the fundamental difference between the two philosophies. The third philosophy is progressivism. It began in the late 1800s and is now mainstream in public schools. It's based on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophy that man is good by nature. Rousseau believed that education should be child-centered and activity-oriented. The roots of evil, he believed, could be traced to corrupt society rather than the innate depravity of man. He believed that primitive cultures were made of sinless people who lived at peace and in harmony with nature. John Dewey, a progressive educator, wrote, "The child's own instincts and powers furnish the material and give the starting point for all education. Save as the efforts of the educator connect with some activity which the child is carrying on of his own initiative, independent of the educator, education becomes reduced to a pressure from without." Progressives most certainly wouldn't want to pressure children from without. John Dewey is known as the father of American education, as well as the greatest humanist of the 20th century, a title he shares with Karl Marx. He was the one who asserted that one of the main purposes for school is, you've probably heard the word, socialization. Progressivism began in the late 1800s, is based on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it says there is no original sin. Evil exists because society corrupts man. It's relativistic, no absolute right or wrong. It's pragmatic. The right and wrong, the judgment of right and wrong is determined by the results an action has. It's focused on socialization. John Dewey actually believed we need groups to become human. People weren't human at birth. They became human through social interaction. Progressivism is closely tied to the theory of evolution. It's forward-looking and optimistic. That's part of its appeal. Everything is evolving in an upward direction, right? What's new is inherently better than what is old. Kids are smarter than their old-fashioned parents and should therefore incessantly question authority. To quote E.D. Hirsch, an essentialist, half-truths, because of their plausibility, are frequently more dangerous than outright mistakes. Is it true that children are born perfect beings? Is it true that they need socialization to become human? Is it true that discipline and punishment are harmful? How you answer these questions reveals your personality and your philosophy. Reconstruction was a 1930s spin-off of progressivism. It's utopian and futuristic. Reconstructionists believe that schools are the necessary agents to change the world and create a new world order, to eradicate racism, poverty, and war. George S. Counts, and a Reconstructionist, wrote, "We hold within our hands the power to usher in an age of plenty, to make secure the lives of all, and to banish poverty forever from the land." The ultimate goal of Reconstructionism is one world government. It is utopian, a futuristic spin-off of progressivism, believing that schools are the agents for ushering in this new world order. And the purpose of education is to raise student consciousness about social, economic, and political problems and to give them tools to solve those problems. Not only Horace Mann, the father of public school education in America, but Adolf Hitler and Karl Marx believed the purpose of education was to raise student consciousness about social, economic, and political problems and give them tools to solve those problems. Reconstructionism never gained much traction in the United States because it denigrated the opinions and religions of parents. Existentialism is the final philosophy that we'll examine. It began in the 1800s. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of its originators, and the philosopher who said God is dead, wrote, "The Superman does not allow himself to be fettered by conventional morality. He is beyond the categories of good and evil. Life is a meaningless void. There is no God, no purpose or plan. Nature and the universe are indifferent to man. If it's true that there is no God, no purpose or plan, existentialism might be true. The question of whether there truly is God is crucially important. If there's no God, why fetter yourself with conventional morality and categories of good and evil? Remember what Jeffrey Dahmer said. If a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? A song that best expresses existentialism is Dust in the Wind by Kerry Livgren. It's a beautiful song, concluding, all we are is dust in the wind. One homeschool mom told me that her son had heard the words once on the radio when they were driving around. He asked her about the song. It was from her that I learned that the writer's spiritual quest continued. He is now a Christian. I'm going to play just a few words from that song so that you can listen to them. Dust in the wind, all they are is dust in the wind. Same old song, just a drop of water in an endless sea. All we do crumbles to the ground, though we refuse to see. Dust in the wind, all we are is dust in the wind. All we are is dust in the wind. Isn't it exciting that the author of that song is now saved by grace? One of my 6th grade students wrote this poem, which beautifully expresses the philosophy of existentialism. Chapters. A book of wasted lives collects dust on a lonely shelf. Painful memories turn pages in the chapter of my life, the chapter of lost love, disappointment, and sorrow. Paragraphs of nothing fill my mind with emptiness, just to be ended with a period. I couldn't believe a 6th grader would have this depth of thought, but she wrote it right in class in front of me. I know she didn't copy it. I often wonder how she's doing now, 30 years later. So existentialism began in the 1800s. The existentialist credo is a lonely, alienated individual caught up in a meaningless and absurd world. Man is condemned to be utterly free and utterly responsible. Existentialists believe that objective, certain knowledge is unattainable, and that we should abandon reason and accept groundless belief by taking a leap of faith. The idea of a blind leap of faith is an existentialist idea attributed to the first one, existentialist Søren Kierkegaard. The most commonly understood meaning is the act of believing in or accepting something intangible or unprovable without empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is evidence acquired by observation or experimentation rather than being taken on authority. The Bible does not ask us to abandon reason and accept groundless belief. On the contrary, Isaiah 1:18 says, "Come, let us reason together." If God exists and gave us the power to reason, He doesn't expect us to just toss it to the wind and take a blind leap of faith. Now we'll talk about 5 questions that have to be answered in any philosophy of education. Number 1, what is the purpose of education? Then what is the role of the teacher versus the child? What should be the standards and objectives? What methods should be used? And how should progress be evaluated? The first question is, what is the purpose of education? Here are a list of possibilities, with the most conservative ideas on the top and the most progressive ones on the bottom. It's to instill traditions, teach traditions, habits, values, knowledge, thinking skills, socialization, happiness, and self-esteem. Think about what you believe is the purpose of education. This list might give you some help. Just a word about habits. The transmission of good habits is basically an essentialist purpose. Here are some thoughts by different philosophers on the topic of habits. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said the only habit the child should be allowed to contract is that of having no habits. So consider the source there. Aristotle said that a culture that neglects to cultivate good habits will soon find itself the prisoner of bad habits. And William Kirkpatrick, a current author, modern-day author, with a book called Why Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong, wrote, "It takes a long time to build up a tradition of shared ideals and civilized habits, but it can be torn down in a surprisingly short time." So moving on to the second question, what should be the role of the teacher and of the student? Who should lead and direct? What are the responsibilities of the teacher and of the student? Does a teacher let things out of students or put things into students? The Jews had a different model for education than did the Greeks. The Jewish model was based on Deuteronomy 6:6-7. "These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up." Think of how Jesus taught. He lived life with his disciples, teaching them lessons in the context of everyday life. The Greek model, by contrast, was more of a classroom lecture style. The teacher talked, students listened and took notes, were tested, and moved on. Paul used this model at times, as did Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. So both models have their place. The third question has to do with standards and objectives. Should there be objective or subjective standards? High or low standards? Should the focus be on the content or on the process? Do high standards frustrate and discourage children or challenge them to do their best? Is what they learn more important than how they learn, or vice versa? Your philosophy needs to answer questions like that. Keep in mind that most people have one predominant philosophy and yet incorporate teaching methods common to different philosophies. Your philosophy determines your priorities, but it doesn't necessarily have to restrict the methods that you use. The fourth question has a lot to do with what methods should be used. Which is best, individual or group instruction? Memorization, cooperative, or competitive? Should learning rotate around experiences, or is book learning good? Should children learn to think mostly inductively or deductively? Now, inductive learning infers general laws from particular instances, whereas deductive learning infers particular instances from general laws. Essentialism, think Aristotle, tends to be more inductive, looking at particular instances and then inferring the general laws. Perennialism, think Plato, tends to be more deductive. Should you require students to memorize? Some people claim memorization stifles creativity and prevents children from thinking outside the box. But here's a quote I found by Dr. Yoshiro Nakamatsu, a Japanese inventor who's alive today and who has more patents than Thomas Edison, including patents for components of the digital watch and many other things that we use every day. He answered an interviewer's question this way. The interviewer asked, "What are the methods used to prepare Japanese children for the strong competition they face, and how does it affect creativity?" Nakamatsu said, "One method is memorization. We teach our kids to memorize until the age of 20, for we have discovered that the human brain needs memorization up to that point. Then, younger people can begin free associating, putting everything together. That's how geniuses are formed." He thinks memorization, especially at a young age, enhances creativity. As an essentialist, I tend to agree. The last question you need to think about as you consider your philosophy of education is, how should progress be evaluated? What's the purpose of evaluation? Should evaluation be subjective or objective, external or internal? Which is better, paper tests or performance tests? Unfortunately, grades or some measure of accomplishment may be necessary when a homeschooled child applies to college. You might have to make concessions and evaluate a bit differently than you would prefer. One advantage of formal testing is that kids themselves don't know that they know something. They need to know that. It gives them confidence. God himself gives tests. He obviously knows in advance how people will do, but they don't know. Abraham was asked to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. It was a test. God knew the result beforehand, but Abraham didn't. The test proved two things: that Abraham trusted God utterly and that God was trustworthy. Earlier in his life, Abraham had struggled with doubt. That was no longer the case. He passed the test. In the handout is a sample vision statement, a sample mission statement, and a sample philosophy of education. I'll just share the shortest one here, the sample mission statement. Our mission in homeschooling is to teach our children about God, His Word, and His world. We desire that they choose salvation and develop into wise, mature, respectful, and well-educated adults whose lives glorify God and make attractive the gospel of Christ to unbelievers. Feel free to add any of the statements in the handout and change them in your own mission statement, vision statement, and philosophy statement. Make them true for you. Remember that my goals for this session were that you leave in touch with a vision for your homeschool that will keep you inspired through good days and bad, having begun to contemplate the big picture, the context for what you're doing, and on your way toward establishing a firm foundation for everything you do in your homeschool. I'd encourage you to go home and open a discussion with your spouse about why you're homeschooling. What is your mission and your vision for your children's future? Take time to get in touch with your dreams and write them down so you can refer to them in the heat of daily life and refocus on why you're doing what you're doing. Find words that lift you above the daily grind and make your heart sing. Remember, the word philosophy simply means love of wisdom. As Christians, we should be lovers of truth and wisdom. Proverbs 4:7 says, "Wisdom is supreme, therefore get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding." Wisdom is supremely valuable. Pray daily for God to grant you wisdom so you can successfully nurture and educate your beloved children day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out.